Welcome to Whispers at Night. Can't sleep? Curl up and listen. I'll share quiet, eerie stories while the rain falls outside into your window. Subscribe, join our little night crew, and hit like if you enjoy the chill. Ready? Let's begin. We were two seniors sharing a small rental and trying to make Halloween fun without doing anything wild. Settled on the most low-effort plan possible. Bake cookies, frost them, binge a scary movie. I drove to the nearly empty grocery store for dough, frosting, and orange and black sprinkles. While I compared brands in the baking aisle, a man at the far end never stopped staring. I didn't look straight at him, but his gaze sat on the edge of my vision the entire time. Holiday or not, the place was quiet, and his attention felt wrong. I paid, hurried out, and started the drive home. The streets were mostly dead, porches still lit, but no one outside. When I pulled into our driveway and stepped out with the bags, a dark sedan rolled past at a crawl, maybe 5 miles an hour. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't see who was inside. As soon as it slipped past our mailbox, it sped up and vanished. It could have been nothing. It didn't feel like nothing. Inside, I told V, my roommate and best friend, about the slow roll. He shrugged, set the oven, and we started debating which movie to watch while a sugar cookie sheet baked. At about 8:30 p.m., our doorbell rang. We exchanged a look. No trick-or-treaters had come in a while, and V went to the door. I watched from the kitchen as he checked the peephole, cracked the door 2 inches, said something I couldn't hear, then shut and locked it. "Who was it?" I asked. "Some guy," V said. "Plastic mask." I asked what he needed. He just breathed. Didn't answer. That jolted the grocery aisle memory. What did he look like? Clothes? Dark hoodie, taller than me, V said. He kept leaning like he was trying to see around me. I crept to the peephole. The porch was empty now, but a sedan sat across the street. Lights and engine off, perfectly aligned with our living room windows. The same model that had crept by earlier. I whispered this to V and motioned him over. Before he reached me, a heavy thud traveled through the house. Dull, structural, like something striking a beam. We froze. Another thud, lower this time, then stillness. The sound had come from below, our basement. I eased the basement door open and peered down. The staircase vanished into a square of dark. We held our breath, no sound. Then, faint and undeniable, shuffling footsteps across the basement floor. I shut the door gently and pressed my weight against it. The knob had no lock. V was already dialing 911. While he spoke, the footsteps drew closer, then stopped directly beneath us at the base of the stairs. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. V squeezed my shoulder and mouthed, "Go." We moved together. He unlocked the front door as quietly as he could, and we slipped out, sprinted to my car, and pulled away. We parked 3 streets over under a streetlight and waited for the police, watching the mirrors, pulse in our throats. At 8:45 p.m., a cruiser rolled up to our place. We followed back. The front door was still locked, no windows broken upstairs. But when the officers cleared the basement, they found the interior door wide open and brittle leaves scattered on the concrete. A window well on the side of the house had been pried. The glass along the frame showed a fresh crack line. In the dust near the sill were partial shoe prints, pointed inward. Whoever came in had done it quietly, waited and listened. The sedan across the street was gone. The officers took our statements and walked to the block with flashlights. No one matching our description. No neighbors had ring cam footage ready to share. With nothing else to hold on, they advised new locks and a simple alarm, and told us to call if anything else happened that night. It didn't. We stayed with a friend, then paid for a security company the next day. A technician pointed out pry marks we'd missed around the window well. Small, careful, practiced. He said whoever did it had probably scoped the house earlier to learn where the bedrooms were, which lights we turned on, and whether that basement door locked. That landed hard. If the person who rang the bell was the same guy from the store, then he had followed me home, lingered long enough to learn our rhythms, and used Halloween as cover to get close without raising alarm. V tried to talk me into coincidences. Lots of dark sedans exist. Any stranger can panic and choose silence when a door cracks. But the 3 beats line up too perfectly in my head. The fixed stare in the grocery aisle, the slow pass at our house, then the mask at the door, while someone else already shuffled under our feet. The worst part was how ordinary the moments felt as they happened. Cookies in the oven, a doorbell, a neighbor's car across the street. You don't expect that clicking sound in your brain, the one that says this person doesn't want candy, he wants entry, to be right. You don't expect your safest plan to be fleeing your own house. We never learned who he was or what he wanted. Nothing was stolen, no windows upstairs were tested. He left as soon as we did, which makes me think the goal wasn't stuff. Maybe he planned to wait for us to sleep, to creep up the stairs at 2 a.m. Maybe he wanted a face-to-face he could control, the kind you can't undo. Or maybe he realized the phone call was in motion and cut his losses. That mystery still sits with me. We changed the locks, added motion lights, installed cameras that ping our phones at 12 bungam and 3 a.m. checks, and screwed a slide bolt onto the basement door. It all helps. But every Halloween since, when the last porch light clicks off at 9 o'clock p.m. and the neighborhood goes quiet, I still catch myself listening, waiting for a heavy, patient footfall where no one should be. I was 32, a boring adult Halloween. I'd cleaned in the morning, set a pumpkin candle on the entry table, queued up a movie, and parked myself on the couch with the candy bowl. At 6:05 p.m., I cracked the front door 2 inches so I could hear the bell better. Our block is small, split-level houses, short driveways, a narrow strip of lawn between the sidewalk and the street. From the couch, I could see the entry. Door on the left, coat hooks on the right, a console table with a candle, and 5 steps down to the living room where the TV glowed. If I stood in the hallway, I could see the whole front yard through the side light. Sight lines were simple, which is maybe why the later part knocked the wind out of me. By 7:42 p.m., nothing. No squeak of costumes, no sugar-high chatter, just the whisper of the furnace and the soft clink of the bowl when I shifted it. The pumpkin candle made the house smell like nutmeg. I considered turning off the porch light and calling it early, but I left it on out of habit. At 8:19 p.m., the bell finally went, one bright ding that sounded too cheerful in the quiet. I grabbed the bowl and met a face already leaning into the crack of the door. White plastic, blank features, oval eye holes. The costume was nothing but a hoodie and that mask. I said, "Take a handful," and held the bowl out. Their hand came up, long fingers, no gloves, and I realized there were no parents or friends hanging back on the sidewalk. Taller than most kids. Close up, through those oval cutouts, I saw the whites of the eyes, bloodshot, dark crescents underneath. I could have said, "Late night," and made a joke. Instead, I stayed practical. "Happy Halloween!" They turned, no reply, and walked down the drive. Their shoes scuffed on the concrete, rubber against grit. The sound stuck with me. 15 minutes later, 8:34 p.m., by the TV timer, I heard a single step on the entry tile. I turned, expecting a knock. There wasn't one. The same white mask stood inside my house, just past the threshold, door still cracked behind him. He didn't talk. He just breathed, a shallow, papery sound that didn't match the quiet of the room. Stared for 2 long heartbeats, then backed out and eased the door shut like he lived there. My hands shook so badly, I set the bowl down on the console table to keep the candy from rattling. I walked to the door and watched him move down the driveway. He turned his head twice to see if I was looking. I was. I locked the deadbolt. The pumpkin candle flickered. I told myself to be a grown-up. I picked up my phone and started dialing non-emergency. Footsteps again, closer, slower. This time no bell, no knock. At 8:40 p.m., I put my eye to the peephole. A man stood on my porch, no costume, mid-40s, brown long-sleeve shirt, jeans. He kept his hands visible, like he'd thought about it. "Hello?" he called. "I'm looking for my kid. You seen them?" His voice was too bright. He did the neighbor in distress cadence so well I almost answered, but the door stayed shut, my thumb still on the call screen. He shifted his weight and leaned toward the peephole, and the porch light caught his face. The same eyes. Bloodshot whites. The same dark half-moons. My stomach went cold. I backed away into the living room and finished the call from there. By 8:46 p.m., the porch was empty. When the officers came at 8:58 p.m., we did the routine. What did you see? What did he say? What was he wearing? We walked to the side yard with their flashlights. In the boxwood by the downspout, one officer used his pen to lift out a white plastic mask and a black hoodie, still warm enough to feel like a person had just stepped out of them. The mask looked harmless in his gloved hand, cheap, glossy, blank. Seeing it there, hidden at the edge of my house, was the first undeniable image that made my mouth go dry. He had not been two people. He had been one person practicing two voices. The officers circled the block. No one answered the description. I watched their patrol car lights slide along the ceiling like pale party decorations. The house felt different without anyone in the doorway, and somehow worse. I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing the soft scuff of rubber on my entry tile, the way the candy rustled when my hand shook, the tiny scratch of plastic as the mask tilted. At 11:12 p.m., I pushed the couch against the front window and set a chair under the knob like I was 16 again. The pumpkin candle had burned down to a sweet waxy puddle that made the house smell like a lie. The next morning, I changed what I could change. I replaced the deadbolt. I screwed a latch into the jamb that flips from the inside. I lowered the storm door so the pneumatic closer hisses for a full second. An audio tripwire only I care about. I added a little battery camera above the porch light and drew the curtains at dusk instead of leaving them open to look festive. I moved the candy bowl to the far end of the console so no one could reach it from outside. Small geometry edits. Small prayers disguised as hardware store receipts. I told myself a story that made sense. Maybe he was casing houses under the cover of trick-or-treating. Maybe he was Hitch and wanted a thrill. Maybe he was just the kind of person who practices sounding like a father because it opens doors. The police took the mask and logged a report number I can quote in my sleep. No one called back. For a week, I heard my house too loudly. The furnace kicking on sounded like a footstep. The mail slot thumped, and my chest went tight. The door chime from the neighbor across the street, one ding, softer than mine, made me stop mid-coffee. The bowl became a motif I didn't ask for. Blue ceramic, a chip on the rim. I kept seeing his hand disappear into it, knuckles brushing the wrappers. Every time I moved it, the hard candies clicked like teeth. I still hand out candy. I still like the small parade of capes and plastic swords and lopsided wings. But the map of the front of my house is different now. Door, console, bowl, 5 steps down, 2 steps up. Deadbolt, latch, camera. In my head, I count them as if counting could slow time if I ever needed to. 2 weeks later, at 9:03 p.m., someone rang and I checked the peephole, and it was a small skeleton with a pirate hat, and his dad in a reflective vest on the sidewalk. Normal. I opened the door, handed over chocolate, and the dad said, "Thanks," and I said, "Have fun." And as they turned away, the boy's plastic sword bumped the console table. The pumpkin candle I hadn't lit since that night wobbled and caught the light from the porch, and for a split second, the glass reflected something oval and pale in the side light. Just my own face, probably, bent and flattened. Still, I locked the door and listened to the latch tongue catch. I tell myself the man moved on. I tell myself the officer's flashlights through the bushes were enough to scatter him. But sometimes, if the house is very quiet and the street is empty, I think about how easy the second act was for him. Mask off, voice changed, the same eyes, and I imagine him somewhere practicing new lines, new clothes, a fresh plastic face folded in a pocket. And the candy bowl, when I wash it, clicks against the sink with a small, hollow knock that sounds exactly like a knuckle on a door. I'm 26, and last Halloween was supposed to be routine. I live alone in a small one-story house on a quiet street. Every year I hand out candy until about 7:45 p.m. Then I watch a scary movie and call it a night. Nothing wild, just porch light on, candy bowl by the door, couch facing the window, TV against the hallway wall. Kids started arriving at 5:30 p.m. Pirates, witches, a tiny astronaut who tripped on my doormat and declared the landing a success. By 7:45 p.m., the stream thinned to almost nothing. I set the bowl on the little bench near the door so I could grab it fast if anyone rang, turned down the porch decorations, and flopped onto the couch. At 8 p.m., a knock. I grabbed the bowl, opened the door, and hesitated. No kids. A middle-aged man stood on my mat in jeans and a brown long sleeve. No mask, no treat bag. He leaned to peer past me into the living room. "Is Aaron here?" he asked. "Who's Aaron?" "My son," he said flatly. "He's trick-or-treating. I lost him." His voice was too calm, like he was reading a script. He didn't describe the kid. He just kept trying to look around me. eyes a little glassy, dark circles like he hadn't slept. When I asked what Aaron was wearing, he didn't answer. He did another slow scan over my shoulder, turned, and walked away without a word, down the steps, out of the porch light, gone to the right. It was off enough that my stomach tightened. At 8:15 p.m., I called the non-emergency number. I told the operator a man had asked for a child named Aaron and acted like he was trying to see into my house. I wasn't sure it was anything, but I wanted it noted. She took my info and said they'd log it. I found Scream on cable around 8:30 p.m. and tried to forget it. The street quieted. No more rings, just the faint scrape of leaves on concrete and the fridge humming behind me. By 11 o'clock p.m., credits rolled. I stood to retrieve the candy bow. Olin caught a flick of movement in the living room window. A shape. By the time I refocused, it was gone. My pulse kicked up. I walked to the glass and leaned to angle out the porch reflection. Nothing but my lawn and the short walkway. I stepped to the peephole. The porch was empty except for a moth fluttering around the light. I turned back toward the couch, and something slammed against the window so hard it popped like a small gunshot. A starburst crack spread from a single, gray-scuffed impact point at chest height. Outside, a figure stood half in shadow, hood up, turned toward the backyard. He looked at me for a heartbeat, then sprinted left along the side of the house into the dark. At 11:15 p.m., I crouched in the hallway nook and dialed 911 with hands that didn't feel like mine. The operator kept me on the line while I stared at the front door and listened for a second hit. None came. The siren grew from a far whine to a close warble, then red and blue washed across my blinds. 2 officers checked the front, side yard, and back fence. One ran a light along the base of the window. The impact mark had a dull smear, like the head of a tool had skidded a quarter inch. In the mulch, a partial sneaker tread faced the backyard. No blood, no broken glass, just a test hit that hadn't quite made it through. They asked if anyone unusual had come earlier. I told them about the man looking for Aaron. The older officer wrote it down. The other swept the side yard again, then called me over. In the hedge, shoved into the leaves, was a cheap white half mask with an elastic string. One of those blank faces from the drugstore. A scratch on the nose, dirt on the cheek. It looked like somebody had ripped it off in a hurry and stuffed it out of sight. They canvassed the block until nearly midnight, knocked on 2 neighbors still awake, then gave me a case number and the standard. Advice: keep the porch light on, lock up, call if anything else happens. They couldn't find the guy. No one else reported a window strike. No one knew a frantic dad named anything, let alone Aaron. I taped plastic over the crack so the pane wouldn't shed shards, nudged a chair under the deadbolt, and sat in the hallway longer than I care to admit, listening to small house sounds magnified by nerves. At 12:15 a.m., I finally went to bed and stared at the ceiling while the occasional car's headlights crawled across the room. The next morning, I bought blackout blinds, longer screws for the strike plate, and a window bar for the slider. A week later, I mounted a camera over the porch and one in the yard. I moved the couch so I can't be seen from the window unless I choose it. Friends joked I turned the house into a tiny bunker. Maybe. It helps. I kept checking local posts and police blotters. No missing child named Aaron that night or the next. No dad canvassing doors. Which means either the man was exactly what he said he was and somehow never called anyone else, or he was never looking for a kid at all. He was looking into houses. Into my house. This year I'll hand out candy again, but the rules changed. The bowl goes on a small table outside with a note at 7:45 p.m. The door stays latched. Curtains stay shut. If anyone knocks after 8:30 p.m., I'll speak through the doorbell cam. I still like the quiet part of Halloween. I just don't like remembering the starburst in my window at 11 p.m. and the feeling that someone in a blank face waited for me to stand up and come closer before he tested the glass. I was a sophomore living in a double with a girl named Kylie. She was the social one. I was the one who pretended homework was a hobby. On Halloween weekend, she begged me to go to a house party off campus. I said no twice and then said yes. At 8 p.m., we called an Uber. I wore a cheap sheet ghost costume that still left my sneakers visible. It crackled like tissue when I walked. The house sat alone on a long road. No sidewalks, trees set back, ditch on either shoulder. Orange string lights on the porch. Inflatable pumpkins in the yard. Music thumping soft enough that you felt it more than heard it until you stepped inside. If you stood on the porch and looked out, you could see maybe 2 streetlights in either direction, each separated by a long run of dark. Sightlines were good on the road, bad in the trees. 1 driveway, 1 front door, 1 thin strip of shoulder where a person could walk without dropping into the ditch. By 8:30 p.m., there were maybe 15 people. Cheap beer, sticky counters. I kept the ghost hood down and smiled like I had a plan. We played rounds of some card game, and I laughed at the right times. At 11 p.m., I found Kylie leaning on the kitchen island, cheeks pink, slurring that she'd crash on the couch. I didn't know the others well enough to beg a ride, and the 2 guys not already drunk were leaving later. I checked the Uber price. Surge, $30 I didn't have. Campus is 10 minutes in a car, I told myself. So, what, 35 on foot? I wasn't sober, but I wasn't wrecked. The weather was dry and cold. I layered the sheet over my hoodie and told Kylie I'd text when I got in. She didn't hear me. At 11:15 p.m., I stepped off the porch into that long hush only small towns have. The music thump dissolved behind me. Leaves ticked along the asphalt in little gusts. Past the property line, the world turned dim. Streetlights came in island Besur. It's 1 minute of glare, 3 or 4 minutes of gray. In the dark patches, I could hear my own breath tapping fast, my sneakers scraping grit, the plastic of the costume whispering with each step. About 5 minutes in, I noticed a car, not driving, parked somewhere behind me on the shoulder. No engine sound, no lights, just a lump in the fog I couldn't swear was there until I looked again, and it wasn't. I told myself it was a mailbox, a pile of bags, a trick of distance. I kept moving. The air smelled like cold dirt and damp leaves. Far off, a train horn bled through the trees and then cut. At 11:30 p.m., when I looked back, that lump had shifted closer. Not by much, just enough to move from one between to the next. Streetlight, dark, streetlight. Each time I turned, it seemed to live in the scene. I said out loud, "It's nothing," and heard how thin that sounded. The road was empty. No houses, no dogs, no porch lights, just the ditch to my right, the tree line beyond, and the occasional sound of something small moving in leaves far inside the dark. My phone was in my pocket, battery in the red, and the Uber price was still ugly. At 11:45 p.m., I heard an engine behind me. Idling low, almost polite, I turned. A dark sedan slid out of the fog with its headlights off and rolled even with my shoulder. The window went down, patchy beard, cap pulled low, face slack like he'd been waiting to be bored. "Where you headed?" he said. His voice had that wet, cheerful tone people use when they're trying to sell you something in an empty aisle. "Late to be walking out here alone." "I'm okay," I said, eyes forward. Sheet crackle, sneaker scrape. I tried to keep my pace steady like I was almost home, and a porch light was about to hit me. "I'll give you a lift," he said. The car matched my speed exactly, tires whispering on the asphalt. I looked over without turning my head. The smile was gone. His face had tightened, the eyes up and hard, and I could see the whites were bloodshot even in the dark. He didn't look older than 35, but the skin under his eyes had that purple fatigue to it. The window was down only halfway, like he wanted to be able to hit the lock without moving. "No thanks," I said again, and tripped a little over the words. The car braked to a stop. The door swung open. He was quick, the kind of quick that comes from rehearsing. Rusty metal smell, a thin hiss from the cooling exhaust, the small sound of his door creaking farther than it needed to. Far down the road, a pair of headlights broke the fog. Another car coming. I didn't think. I moved into the lane and windmilled my arms at shoulder height, the way you do when you need to look big. The sedan driver paused, half out of his seat, then slid back in with this abrupt, angry neatness. He reached to the console and the window went up. He shut the door and the car pulled forward, slow enough to broadcast that he wasn't leaving because of me. The oncoming car slowed. I swung back to the shoulder. The sedan accelerated, ghosted past me, and vanished into the next dark patch without ever turning on its lights. The car that stopped was a hatchback from the party. I recognized the driver's face, but not his name. He leaned over and popped the passenger door. "Hey," he said, "you good?" "Can you take me to campus?" I said. My voice warbled, and I hated that. "Yeah," he said, easy, like this was a normal thing to ask at midnight in the fog. "Get in." At 12 a.m. we reached my dorm. The lobby smelled like bleach and old pizza. The exit sign's red glow made everything look cartoon safe. I told him thanks, and he said, "No problem. In that way, where you both agree not to dig into the details." Back in the room, the ghost sheet lay in a sad heap on my chair like a bad joke. I locked the door. Then I locked it again even though it hadn't turned. My hands were shaking enough that I had to hold the knob for a beat to be sure. I texted Kylie I was back, and she sent 3 heart emojis at 12:15 a.m. Campus police said I could file a report in the morning if I wanted. They asked for a make and model, and all I had was dark sedan. They asked for a plate, and I had fog. They asked whether the man touched me, and I said no, because he hadn't, not with his hands. After that night, I changed little things. I set a rule to pay the Uber. I saved a rideshare coupon code in notes, with the screen brightness always up before I leave a party. I walk on the side where the ditch is shallow enough to jump. I carry a small flashlight because headlights off is an image that doesn't go away. I tell someone when I'm coming and when I should arrive, and I make them text at 11:45 p.m. if I don't check in at 11:30 p.m. None of it makes me brave. It makes me boring and alive. Sometimes, passing the costume store window in October, I see the same cheap sheet ghost folded on a shelf, eyes cut out too big and lopsided. That's the last thing I saw in the porch light before we left at 8 p.m. Me as a joke, thin fabric whispering when I moved. The image I can't shake is different. Headlights off, window half down, a car moving at the speed of my steps. Every year when the air turns leaf cold and the fog sits low over that road, I picture that car easing along beside me again, quiet as breath, like it had all the time in the world to wait for the dark between the lights. I was in 8th grade the year we decided we were too old for trick-or-treating. By 7 p.m., I was at Tyler's place, both of us restless. We needed something to do. Tyler had a target, an old mine or drainage tunnel a few miles south of town. Older kids dared each other to visit it. He had half-baked directions. We grabbed one flashlight, his, hoodies, and bikes. The map in our heads was simple. Cracked county road, a narrow dirt turnout, a game trail that clipped 30 yards of scrubs to a thin footpath, then a clearing with the tunnel cut into a low hill. Trees on 3 sides, the hill on the 4th. One way in, same way out. We pedaled through a quiet neighborhood. Porch lights on, bowls out, not many kids. By 7:30 p.m., the houses thinned, the air got leaf cold and damp. We chained our bikes to a bent sapling by the turnout and took the path. Wet leaves made a tacky squeak under our shoes. The wood smelled like mildew and iron. Tyler's beam threw a narrow cone. I walked inside it to save my ankles. We lost the path twice where it dissolved into ground cover, then found it again by snapped-board twigs and a darker strip of mud. At 8:15 p.m., we stepped into a hard-edged clearing. Oval, trampled grass, a few bottle caps. In the hillside, a dark, waist-high hole, backpack off, small. Tyler swept the beam across the mouth. Dust hung in it like gnats. Inside, rough rock, no braces, just a tube that ate the light. My skin tightened. I glanced back at the trees we'd come through. For a half second, a shape shifted near a trunk, branch, deer, and then nothing. "Shine over there," I said. He did, just brush. We went in anyway. The temperature dropped a notch. Our breath turned faint white. The air tasted like chalk. Every footstep slapped and echoed too long, as if the tunnel was larger than it looked. Tyler kept the beam waist high. The floor sloped gently down. We didn't talk, cease, and came back smeared and late. At 8:30 p.m., we heard it. A voice ahead, low and carrying, like someone whispering into a metal pipe. Then another, closer. Tyler froze. I froze. He pushed the light deeper, only black. The whispering paused, then returned, hurried and unintelligible. We didn't debate it. We turned around. The echo changed immediately, like something behind us had started moving too. Our footfalls doubled. I kept glancing back, hoping to catch a silhouette in the edge of the beam. Nothing. The whispering didn't fade. It matched us, same pace, same soft rush, like it was riding our noise. We were 30 feet from the mouth when the tunnel went suddenly quiet. No whisper, no echo, just our breathing and the scrape of rubber on grit. Tyler killed the light for a heartbeat, then snapped it back on. The black didn't flinch. We walked faster. We stepped out at 8:45 p.m. and stopped. 10 yards across the clearing stood a Sultan. Not a costume, not a kid. Plain jacket, dark cap, hands at his sides. He was mid-stride, as if he'd been walking toward the mouth, and paused the second we appeared. That image still sticks. Him planted in the open, squared to us like he'd been listening for our steps, the cold air lifting the edge of his jacket. Tyler's beam slid up his chest to his face. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't speak. His eyes flashed like glass, narrowed, and he was older than we'd guessed. We ran. No plan, just cut right, away from the footpath, into skinny trunks and low branches. Twigs whipped our sleeves. Leaf mold sprayed. I didn't hear him follow. I also didn't check. We bled speed after a minute and kept a fast walk, breath burning, ears straining. Once something scuffed bark and we froze. A squirrel streaked upward. The forest suddenly smelled like sap and metal. We moved again. We found the path by luck and the turnout by the road's pale strip through the trees. At 9:15 p.m. we reached the bikes. No one at the shoulder, no idling car. My hands shook on the lock. We didn't talk until we were back under streetlights where we could pretend it never happened. Later we tried to make it make sense. Maybe hunters. Maybe the voices were other kids. But why stand dead center in the clearing without a word? Why time it so he was crossing toward the entrance in the minute we were trapped between black rock and open ground? Why feel measured long before we stepped out? That layout was the problem. One narrow path, one clearing, one hole in a hill. If you wanted to corner two dumb 8th graders, you'd put a body outside and a voice inside and wait for the flinch. We turned around just in time to see an exit that had already been claimed. After that night, I changed small things. If I hike after dark, almost never, I share my location and set check-ins for 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. I carry my own light. I stop when a place gives me only one way out. It's boring and maybe cowardly, but it beats remembering chalk dry air and that man holding still in the cold at 8:45 p.m., as if he'd been waiting for our exact footsteps, and would be waiting again if we ever came back. By 5 at that Halloween, the three of us, me, Marco, and Theo, met on my porch in cheap black hoodies and dollar store masks. We were 8th graders and pretty sure this was our last year we could pass for trick-or-treaters. Our school had a half day. We'd already compared candy strategies over pizza, and now we just wanted to run a fast loop before the porch lights clicked off. I carried a plastic skull bucket that clacked like a bell every time a fun-size bar hit bone. That stupid thing became the metronome of the night. Our neighborhood is a grid that dead ends into a narrow strip of woods. Across that strip, 50, maybe 60 yards of trees, there's a single road of custom houses locals call the Ridge. The Ridge is big porches, long setbacks, long driveways, and rumor-level full-size candy bars. If you stand at the end of my cul-de-sac and face east, you see our street, then the four-way stop, then the narrow footpath into the trees, then the ridge road rising slightly so you can't see what's coming over the crest until it's on you. Streetlights are far apart, little islands of yellow with long, dark gaps. If someone's on the sidewalk with you, you spot them as a shape first, face later. We started down at 5:15, still a hint of orange in the sky. We hit the closest blocks first. Doorbells, trick or treat, the plastic skull filling up with the weight of chocolate. Leaves crackled under our sneakers. Somewhere a speaker looped a cackling witch. Someone's dog huffed against a glass door. When I breathed through the cheap rubber of my mask, it smelled like tires. We joked about how old we felt until someone handed us a king size, and we shut up. By 6:30, we'd cleared our side of the grid and moved toward the footpath. The air cooled fast. You could smell damp earth and that faint cold metal scent the air gets in late October. Under the trees it got dark enough the sad coal. Cars on the ridge flashed between trunks like a lighthouse. The path is 2 bodies wide at best, rough with exposed roots. You go in, bend right, climb a shallow rise, and pop out between 2 stone columns onto the ridge sidewalk. We did that, stayed in a tight file, the skull bucket clacking, and emerged to a view of big houses spaced much farther apart than we'd remembered. Great, longer walk between doorbells. We jogged house to house, trying to beat the porch light cutoffs. The candy hit the skull with that hollow clunk. At one place, a mom in a witch hat said, "Last call, guys. Lights out at 7:45. It was 7:30, my phone said. We picked up the pace. By the third house after that, 7:45 exactly, their lights went dark as we left the porch. The ridge emptied fast. The little kids disappeared first, then the middle schoolers, then us, and the road got quiet in a way that made our footsteps sound like we were intruding. We turned back toward the footpath at 80 with our buckets heavy and our jokes thinning out. That's when we noticed the guy. He came up over the slight rise ahead of us, a single figure moving at a steady walk right down the middle of the road, hood up, hands in pockets, no costume, no kid, no bag. It was too dim to see a face. We did the default suburban thing, crossed to the other sidewalk as if we'd planned it. He angled his head just enough that I could tell he was tracking us. Not a big movement, not a wave, just a quiet lock-on. We kept our speed up. You don't sprint because sprinting is admitting you're scared, and we were still playing the "we're older now" game. I kept glancing back. Under one streetlight, he became a cutout. The hood hiding his face, the shoulders squared, the slight hitch in his step, like one shoe scuffed. When we slipped into the darkness between lights, my chest went light and tight, in that way it does right before you say something. Dumb. The plastic skull knocked against my knee. Clack, clack, clack. Shortcut through birch, Theo whispered, nodding left at the next intersection. Footpath's quicker, Marco said. We chose speed over smart and went straight for the footpath. We made the next light, then the dark, then saw him again. Only not in front of us anymore. He was to our right, at the edge of a big lot, where the lawn meets the trees, standing half in shadow, waiting. We all stopped like we'd hit an invisible line. I bumped into Marco, the skull bucket rattled. Under the next light, I saw him clearly for one full second. Hood up, face forward, but shadowed. Chin tilted the way you do when you want to see without giving your face to someone. No kid, no bag. The street behind him empty. The house he stood beside was dark. Porch light off, blains down. We tried to play it cool. We walked again. He stepped out from the tree line and matched us, angling to intercept. That broke whatever thin line of pride was holding us in place. We bolted, straight across the street and into the trees opposite, the stupid skull slewing candy like a slot machine dumping coins. Branches whipped our sleeves. Our sneakers went from leaves to dirt to roots. The air inside the woods was colder, the smell stronger, wet bark and rot. We ran blind for 30 seconds, maybe 40. My mask slid sideways. I tore it off and stuffed it in my hoodie. We stopped because we had to. Breathing sounded loud enough to carry to the next county. I crouched behind a fallen trunk. Through brush to my left, I could see a sliver of the ridge road and a swing of yellow light as a car passed. Everything else was black shapes and the white flash of our breath. We stood there listening. At first it was just the night noises coming back. A distant engine, a single dog bark, the light tick of something settling. Then, different. A slow crush of leaves, not a deer bounce. Human pace. A few steps, stop. A few stop. We didn't talk. The communication was all hands. Marco's palm flattened. Stay. Theo's finger pointed. Left. The sound drifted like whoever it was trying to sweep the woods without committing to a straight line. I tightened my grip on the skull bucket because I needed something to hold. It clicked against my knuckles. I flinched like I'd fired a gun. The footsteps came closer, then veered away again. Dirt shifted, a branch snapped, distant, then nothing. We waded through what felt like 10 minutes and was probably 2. Somewhere behind us, a car door thunked shut. That single sound made me realize we'd run deeper than I'd thought. We weren't near the footpath anymore. We were in the strip behind the big lots, the part kids use for forts in summer, and parents warn you about in fall because coyotes come through. Back left to the grid, I whispered, and even in a whisper my teeth clicked on the D. We cut left, using the faint downhill pull as a guide, because downhill meant our side. I kept glancing back, and every time the dark looked like it had a head and shoulders. The underbrush snagged at our jeans. The skull bucket thumped my thigh like a heartbeat I couldn't get in sync with. We found fence, chain link, cold and rattly. On the other side, lawn. A porch light glowed 2 houses down. We followed the fence to the corner, squeezed through a gap where kids had clearly squeezed before, and tumbled into somebody's yard. A motion light blasted on. For the first time all night, the brightness felt like armor. We crossed the grass fast, hopped the low hedge, and popped out on Maple, back in our grid, under one of our sensible lights. Only then did we look back toward the woods. Between two trunks, just for a breath, I saw a darker shape shift and hold. Far enough that I couldn't swear to it. Near enough that I didn't need to. We didn't call the cops. We were dumb and tired and had been trespassing through 3 yards, and it felt like the kind of thing adults would turn into a lecture about staying in at night. We speed walked to my house. It was 8:45 when we burst in and slammed the door. My mom shouted from the kitchen, "Everything okay?" I said, "Yeah, we're done," and dumped the skull on the table. A mini Snickers slid to the top and stared back at me with that dumb swoosh. We spread the candy and tried to turn the night into a story where we were brave instead of sloppy. But every time somebody's shoe scuffed in the driveway outside or a neighbor's screen door squeaked, all three of us went quiet in the exact same way. When Marco's mom picked him up at 9:15, he said, too casually, "We'll cut through on Birch next time." Theo texted at 9:45 from home. Dude stood under my skin. A day later, I told my dad we'd seen some sketchy guy up on the ridge. He suggested calling the HOA. They could add a sign by the footpath, "No trespassing after dusk," as if ink on metal does anything against a person who chooses to stand where the lights don't reach. The next week, I swapped my skull bucket for a plain pillowcase. Quieter, easier to carry. I walked the ridge in daylight once, just to see the sight lines with the sun up. Long lawns, long shadows. Now, when I run past at 5 us on a Tuesday, I catch myself scanning the tree line where lawn turns to dark. No one posted about anything that night. No missing kids, no arrest. It was probably just a guy out walking. That's what I tell myself when I need sleep. But the image that ends the story for me isn't him moving or speaking. It's him pausing at the edge of the trees, inside that slice of shadow just beyond the streetlight's reach, like someone studying a map and waiting for the dots to arrive. Every October since, I hang a plastic skull on our porch. It clacks in the wind. I lock the door at 7:45. I walk friends to the corner, and I try not to think about how easy it was for one hood and a few steps to turn a holiday into a place I won't go without looking back.